Awesemo NFL Yahoo show, sponsored by Yahoo, and I'm pretty excited about this because I'm doing a show with Steve Buzzard. Steve, we've, in brief passing, we've seen each other in Zoom. We're like, you're exiting a show, I'm entering, but we've never actually done this together on the internet before.
Yeah, pretty crazy the way that works out. Definitely love checking out your shows all the time. So yeah, glad to get to be a part of it, and hopefully we'll be able to do this a little bit more often.
Yeah, and for sure, also getting to talk about Yahoo, also something that I haven't done a lot of Yahoo shows as of late. But for football, I actually really like their football product, and we were talking about it right before. There's some pretty soft pricing over on Yahoo right now, so it's kind of easy to fit in the guys that you want to play over on Yahoo. And we're going to be identifying some of the overall best options that we could get on there in terms of points per dollar. But first, if you guys want to go play over on Yahoo, head on over to the site and use the promo code Awesemo25. That is Awesemo and then 25. And that'll get you a $25 bonus that's paid in Yahoo Sports reward points. That is for new users. However, also, if you're an existing user and use the promo code Awesemo25 and make a deposit, you'll receive a free $10 contest entry into the Yahoo $1 million NFL Baller contest this week. So, watch this show. Also, like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Lots of content overall for the NFL season, also everything else. MLB, we've got MLB Live Before Lock later, MLB Deeper Dive. But right now, Steve and I are going to be digging into some of the overall Yahoo strategy for this week. And just one thing I want to ask you before we dig into some of the players and position by position, is there anything you look at on Yahoo that maybe makes you approach it differently than something like FanDuel or DraftKings?
So the biggest thing that stood out to me, first of all, just from an overall pricing standpoint, is you can fit in the San Francisco defense. They're just so cheap, $12. So that just helps you really build in some other positions and have a little bit extra money to spend there. So I think that's one thing that stands out. The other thing that stands out is just in general, we think about playing the Millie Maker, for instance, on some other sites. Granted, Yahoo has really big contests as well, but they're not quite as big as some of the other sites, so you don't have to be quite as contrarian with your lineups. You can win first place without the quite as optimal of a lineup as you might have to have on some of the other sites. And then also, a lot of the pro players don't play as heavily at Yahoo, so the contests are a little bit softer. So that's just another reason why you don't have to get quite as contrarian. So I do think in general you should probably not play quite as contrarian on Yahoo as you might on some other sites.
And then I don't want to grill you too hard on this, but just kind of general, without making you feel like I'm interrogating you, but general type strategy. In terms of Yahoo, DraftKings, FanDuel, DraftKings, we might be looking to stack pretty heavily to maximize upside. Do you think in a case like Yahoo, where maybe the games aren't quite as soft, we can maybe play some just the best points per dollar plays and not necessarily have to worry about optimizing the maximum amount of upside? Not saying that we're not going to be stacking, but maybe we don't have to worry as much about like mini stacks and lineups.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. The one thing you can do is you can get pretty good lineups even just by stacking more. It's an easier way to not necessarily the mini stacks, but maybe a 3-man stack instead of a 1-man stack. Because in reality, you are limiting some upside to your stacks if you go to a 3-man stack, for instance, because both Metcalf and Lockett can't score a touchdown at the same time, but you are having a better probability that they correlate well, so that they'll have, like, instead of a ceiling of a lineup of maybe having 200 points, they might have a ceiling of 190, but they get up to that score more often together. So I think you can certainly do something like that on Yahoo a little bit more frequently.
All right, so let's dive into the slate and just starting with the quarterback position. And the number one thing that stands out, and by the way, also, if you go over to awesemo.com, not only do we have projections for Yahoo, but also a lot of our tools are also applicable to Yahoo. So something that I like to use when I'm trying to make my stacks is the Top Stacks tool, which is, it's not quite the same as what we see for something like MLB, but still, I think it's something to look at as a good resource in terms of which teams, which quarterbacks have the best likelihood of being the highest scoring and are good ones to stack. And the first thing that stands out to me here is we do have the Kansas City Chiefs, Patrick Mahomes, unsurprisingly, the team most likely to be the top stack on the slate, 17.4% chance. However, Patrick Mahomes is not the most popular quarterback on the slate. That honor goes to Josh Allen. And overall, the amount of quarterbacks here roster, it's pretty flat. There's not like one guy who's massively more popular than everybody else. 13.1% for Josh Allen compared to 8.1% for Patrick Mahomes. But still, I think that actually, let me make sure I have the most recent update here. But even so, it does appear Josh Allen is going to be a little bit more popular than Mahomes. Yet we have Mahomes with a better likelihood of being the highest scoring quarterback and that team being the top stack. So that to me is making me think that maybe I want to be a little lighter on Josh Allen, a little heavier on Patrick Mahomes. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think that I would probably lean that same way as well. When I don't know that it's going to stand out for me like a huge amount, I guess, between those. I think that they're all close enough in the amount of rosters that they're going to be on that you don't have to necessarily go overboard fading one or specifically going heavily on the other. And the same, you could throw Kyler Murray kind of in that same group as well. I think he's right up there. I think all of those guys, I'm more than happy to get them in some of my lineups, and the exposures that I have are from a crunch that I kind of ran right here before the show is pretty flat, just like what we're seeing on our top stacks tools.
Yeah, and once again, the team most likely to be the top stack, we do have the Kansas City Chiefs at 17.4%. Buffalo does come in second with Josh Allen, quarterback, at 13.8%, yet there's only about a fourth of the amount of lineups that are going to have Patrick Mahomes as compared to Josh Allen in our projections right now. But I do think Kyler Murray also makes for a pretty interesting pivot play off those guys. You mentioned him there. We currently have Murray projected to be in 2.8% of lineups compared to those other guys, especially Josh Allen, nearly 10x the ownership of him. So with Kyler Murray, I kind of think he's, I don't want to say a sleeper because everybody's aware of him, but go back to last year. You remember the first, 10 weeks of the season, Kyler Murray was the number one overall scoring fantasy player. And then he dealt with some injuries down the stretch of the year and struggled a little bit. But he's somebody who, if he ends up being the top overall fantasy quarterback this year, I wouldn't be surprised. And he's somebody that also I kind of want to get on as a contrarian option this week.
Yeah, no doubt. So Kyler Murray was one of my favorite plays in season long and best ball type drafts, just because of the upside that you're mentioning. He has that just ability to, blow up any given week, and I think he has a good probability to be one of the higher guys overall for the whole season too. And he has another year with Hopkins, so they last year was kind of the first year of them playing together. So I think there's a good chance that you could see Kyler Murray have a really good game here in this spot. His price is cheaper than both of those two, quite a bit cheaper than Mahomes actually as well. So I think it's a pretty good spot. The matchup against Tennessee is not ideal, so his implied total is a bit lower, 25 compared to 29 and 27 it looks like for those other two guys. But yeah, I think if his ownership is coming in a bit lower, then he's definitely worth that pivot.
Yeah, Kyler Murray right now $34 right now, as if the price here is going to change by the time that Sunday comes around. But $34 for Kyler Murray, $40 for Patrick Mahomes, who does offer a little bit of salary savings there. Here's somebody that popped up in a lot of my crunches, and I'm kind of curious what your opinion is on him, and that's Jalen Hurts. He's obviously going to be a fantastic fantasy quarterback as long as he's on the field this year, even if he doesn't play well for real life purposes, in my opinion, just because of his rushing upside. It was something we saw down the stretch of last year when Jalen Hurts took over for Carson Wentz. He racked up so many fantasy points on the ground because last 4 games of the year when he started, these were his rushing numbers. 18 carries for 106 yards, 11 for 63 and a touchdown, 9 for 69, and 8 for 34 with 2 touchdowns. There's obviously massive rushing upside here, but one thing that's kind of tripping me up a little bit as I'm building my lineups is I don't really know who I want to stack Jalen Hurts with. So 2-part question here. Number 1, how much do you like Jalen Hurts for Yahoo tournaments? And then number 2, do you think it's okay to play him naked, not with one of his pass catchers?
So yeah, Jalen Hurts is right there with those other guys for me. His price at 26 is enough of a price down to be able to get to him as compared to those other guys. So I think that's good. I mean, he showed, like you said, his rushing upside is a is a big deal. He won a lot of people their season-long leagues last year with that end of the season, especially the 38 Yahoo points that he had in week 15. That was a week that, won season-long, got people to their finals in the season-long leagues, and also won a lot of people GPPs. That's the type of upside I think you can have every week with Hurts. For stacking wise, I do think that you probably should stack him. I don't know that you have to because of some of the upside that we just talked about. You don't need quite as much in Yahoo contests, but I think it is still advisable. If he gets there high enough that he's going to win you a league, I think it still makes sense to probably stack him with somebody at least.
So for me, the stacks, and let me just sort this in Fantasy Cruncher, but the player who I end up getting the most stacks of with Jalen Hurts was Dallas Goedert at tight end. In terms of receiving options, I just think there's better overall points per dollar play as a receiver than some of the guys on the Eagles roster, like Devontae Smith or Jalen Reagor. So ultimately, I mean, tight end is kind of a thin position on Yahoo anyway. So Goddard was somebody who kind of made the most sense to me, but also, there's always going to be, and this is something I didn't used to do a couple of years ago, but because of quarterback, actually specifically Lamar Jackson, I had to change my process and how I build lineups in Fantasy Cruncher because some of these quarterbacks, I kind of have to, I feel like I have to play them naked sometimes. And even though I do agree with you, I don't want to exclusively play Jalen Hurts naked. It's possible that he has one of these games like he had down the stretch of last year where last game of the season, he has 8 carries for 34 yards and 2 touchdowns. But he passes for 72 yards and just doesn't do that much damage through the air. So, we've seen him kind of operate in that running back / quarterback type role. So he's like an exception to somebody who I'd be looking to play naked. But I don't know that there's really anybody else that stands out to me at that kind of extent. Something that does project pretty well for us on a points per dollar basis is Tyrod Taylor, kind of across all sites through the industry for this weekend. But he's somebody else who, number one, I don't really know what we're getting out of him this year. And then number two, I also have no clue who I'd want to stack with him, if anybody. So is Tyrod Taylor somebody who you view as a viable contrarian option?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the big things that you want to take into consideration a fair amount in week one, I think, is just how much variability and situation unknownness, I guess. I don't know if that's a word or not, but, unpredictability. Anyways, I think that's a big thing that you want to take into consideration. I don't think there are going to be very many people rostering Tyrod Taylor because Houston is, thought of to be kind of a train wreck, and I think that's probably pretty fair. But you never know. Things could. Jacksonville's not a great team historically, and even the worst teams are going to score points and have outlier type of games. So we don't know what we're going to get out of Taylor and the Houston offense. So I think that if he's only going to be on like 1% of rosters, some number really low like that, I definitely want to be over the field on that. And that case holds for pretty much anybody that I'm not so certain about. And then the flip side, if there's someone that you feel like their situation is very unpredictable here in week one, and their ownership is getting high just because maybe their price is really good or a lot of people are touting that specific player, I think those are the guys that I want to go on the flip side on and probably fade pretty heavily. So Tyrod Taylor, I think, is in my pool, not like super high as these other guys, but maybe around 5% of my roster or something like that.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, Tyrod Taylor, we do have him project for about 19 fantasy points on a points per dollar basis. That does make him the number one value in our projections for Yahoo this week. Not that means I'm dying to play him, but it at least warrants me to pique my interest a little bit and get him into some lineups here. But on the flip side of that game, somebody else who I think is interesting is Trevor Lawrence. Just from a standpoint of he's one of the most heralded quarterback prospects we've ever seen enter the league. And then also, like we mentioned with Houston, they're probably going to suck this year. If you look at a new tool that we have up on the site that something that I know that you worked on also that I think is really valuable is we have all different kinds of prop betting tools and season-long tools and all of that over on Awesemo.com. And if you look at our team projections for the year, we have the Houston Texans projected to win 4 games this year, the least of any team in the league. And by the way, even that is above what their win total is at sportsbooks this year, just for reference on how bad this team is expected to be. But Trevor Lawrence is going to be in a very good matchup. He has a favorable price tag. And when we talk about some of the receivers later, to me, I think Laviska Shenault at $15 is one of the most valued players on the entire Yahoo slate. So for that reason, Lawrence makes sense because it's a good matchup. And there's somebody who I very easily could see myself stacking with him. So to me, he's actually fairly high priority play in his first NFL game.
Yeah, for sure. I think that Lawrence would makes a lot of sense. He fits that mold exactly as well. He has the upside that people are, maybe not fully baking into how often that they're going to roster him. Now, at the same time, I think there is a chance that we could see him really get a lot of hype here the next 2 days, and kind of the number of people that are willing to go with him skyrockets. So kind of watch where that trends here the next couple of days. But if he stays kind of in that middle range, I definitely want to get on top of him. You can go with Laviska to go with him for sure. We don't know exactly how they're going to use Marvin Jones, so that's certainly a way that we could go as well. Or Chark, I don't think is a very bad option also. So I think he has lots of different ways that you can go there, and they're going to score some points. It's probably one of the better ways to open up your career game against this Houston team. It's on the road. That's the only thing that's probably not as ideal for your first game, but I think that it's a good spot for Lawrence, and I think you should definitely have him a big part of your pool.
Yeah, definitely a good way to dip his toes into the NFL waters. They probably the worst team and arguably the worst defense in the entire league, but that kind of wraps up the quarterbacks that I have a decent amount of exposure to in the build that I made earlier today. Is there anybody else that was popping up for you in a meaningful way, or somebody that stands out to you as a contrarian option?
Yeah, so also I was just looking here on Lawrence. His team total is 24, almost as high as Kyler Murray. So that tells you a lot about what you need to know about Houston as well. The other one that is kind of standing out to me a little bit, I guess two guys just as maybe contrarian options, and they're both for the same reason that I was mentioning about kind of unpredictableness, is Teddy Bridgewater and Tua. Both of them. So Bridgewater being on a new team, a team that was riddled with injuries last year, with Courtland Sutton, should be back, but he's looking like he's a little bit dicey on how, if he's 100% back, right? If he's 100% healthy. I don't think there's any limitation on his snaps or anything like that, but it's just how productive he will be. But Bridgewater could come in. They could be able to open up the passing game a little bit against the Giants. Their team total is pretty weak, but just because of that uncertainty, I don't think there's going to be a lot of people on him. And his $20 price tag is really quite cheap. So I think he's an option. And then the same thing, the same $20 price tag for Tua, I think that could be pretty interesting. I mean, just a year ago, Tua was thought to be one of the best upcoming prospects that we've had in the league in a few years. And I know that he didn't live up to that hype last year, and it does concern me a little bit that maybe the Dolphins kept being rumored around Watson. I don't know if they really were interested in him. If they were, then that's a pretty bad sign for Tua. But I'm still willing to give some credit to his last, his hype that was built around him, and all the people that saw some upside on him, at least for this first couple of weeks. What do you think about those guys?
Yeah. So one thing I'm going to add about Tua is, so it kind of goes hand in hand when I'm looking to stack quarterbacks for me personally, is because I also want it to be like, what are the like reasonable receiving options that I could pair them with. And I'm getting to a lot of Devontae Parker in my build. I think that he's one of the better wide receiver plays on Yahoo this week at just $14. So I think that's a very good stack, and also very cost effective when we're able to get Devontae Parker and Tua stacked together. So to me, I'm getting to not a lot of Tua right now, but that's something who, maybe when I'm digging into making more of my lineups tomorrow, Sunday morning, I might be upping my exposure to Tua. That's actually one guy who I was looking at my build and would like to get more of, number one, because of his price, and then number two, also because Devontae Parker, I think, is a pretty reasonable stack partner for him.
Yep, no doubt. I think that's a good one. And Waddle is a little bit unpredictable too, right? He just being this young guy that is had a lot of draft capital spent on him. it could be the combination that needs to step things up.
All right, so let's move on to the running back position now. And listen, due to a lot of the soft pricing over on Yahoo, it's not that hard to get lineups that have one of, if not both, of Derrick Henry and Christian McCaffrey in them. So our guy Butho Jenkins, who's always in the YouTube chat, who's always his signature comes in, cut the crap, who was the best play on the slate. To me, it's McCaffrey and Henry. The pricing is soft on Yahoo. It's not difficult to fit them in. If you play cash games on Yahoo, I think the first thing you do is you start with Derrick Henry and Christian McCaffrey. I don't think anybody's going to take too much umbrage with me saying that. Alvin Kamara also is in the mix, but I still prefer Henry and McCaffrey to them. Are you also finding that too? That you're finding it fairly easy to get to Henry and/or McCaffrey in builds?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. I think that's the way to spend up with the soft pricing. Just go get those guys, plug them in. The slight worry about McCaffrey, he was out for a long time, but I think he's going to be fine. And for cash games, you might as well put him in there.
And the other thing to remember is with McCaffrey last year, even in the limited amount of time he played last year, he crushed. But, all the games, which isn't that surprising. But in Yahoo scoring last year, 27 fantasy points, 23, 32. And even that game where he played in week 9, where he missed, he played week 1, week 2. He missed all the games up to week 9. And then he actually ended up getting hurt in week 9. And they said coming into the game, he was going to be on a pitch count. He ends up catching 10 passes for 82 yards in the touchdown, rushing 18 times for 69 yards in the touchdown. So in the 3 games that Christian McCaffrey played last year, he scored multiple touchdowns in all 3 of them. I don't have any sort of real massive concerns there. The only thing I would really say is a maybe negative about him is that we have Alvin Kamara, Dalvin Cook, and Derrick Henry to choose from, and that is a lot of options on the pay-up end. I want to get exposure to guys like Dalvin Cook and Alvin Kamara, but for me, I gravitated towards Derrick Henry and Christian McCaffrey as the most popular spend-up options for me. But in terms of value now, here's somebody for a cheaper price tag that I ended up getting to quite a bit, and that is Clyde Edwards-Helaire. And it's a little hard for me to know exactly what to make here. Number one, he missed time in the preseason. He dealt with an ankle injury. His rookie season, he got off to a really hot start. He kind of faded a little bit towards the end of the year. But still, I look at CEH as a guy this year who, first of all, only $18 to open the season. That's a very favorable price tag. He's going to be involved in the pass game. That end, it's the Chiefs offense. They're going to be scoring a lot of points. I guess the one concern is he going to get the goal line touches or not? But at least in terms of value at running back, I do view him as the best cost-effective option on Yahoo.
Yeah, I think I think he's a really good option, especially, they have the highest team total on the slate at almost 30. And if they end up running it in, there's a good chance that that's going to be CEH that scores. You're right. His second half of the year was pretty disappointing. He went from being a rookie in season-long leagues, being a first-round draft, to kind of a much later draft. Sometimes you could even get him in the third rounds this year. So that just shows you how much the perception of CEH has changed over the last year. I think that's going to keep the number of people that are rostering him kind of in check. But that doesn't keep me away from him. So it just makes me even more interested in him. All the points that he's going to score, I know Mahomes is going to move the ball on Cleveland. I think this could be the game that really shoots out. It has, pretty sure, the highest total on the board. It has the highest total. So I could see it shooting out pretty well. And CEH could also be icing the game a little bit down the stretch. So I think he's a really good play. Almost as good as some of those other guys when you take into consideration his $18 price tag.
Yeah, 54.5 is the total in that Chiefs-Browns game. The only game that's close is the Titans-Cardinals game at 54. There's not another game on the slate with a total over 50 points. So those 2 games, if you're looking to make a full game stack, at least from that standpoint of which games are likely to be the highest scoring, which games are most likely to be what we saw on Thursday night between the Bucs and the Cowboys, I think Chiefs-Browns and Titans-Cardinals, those are the 2 most likely candidates. And I want to ask you, how are you handling Austin Ekeler right now? And it's something I feel like we need a little bit of more information on before we really make a decision. But, at least as it stands right now, Friday afternoon, Austin Ekeler, he was sidelined due to a hamstring issue at practice on Thursday. I haven't seen an update on him yet for today. For now, let's assume that he is going to play. He is currently only $21 on Yahoo. That is something that gets me to him in a good portion of my lineups. But how concerned should we be about this hamstring issue?
Yeah, that's a good question. With no injury, I think Ekeler is probably one of the best prices in the industry in reality. So $21 for him is a good price. And if I don't bump him down at all for injury, he ends up actually being my highest, the guy that comes up in the crunches the most often for me. So I would go for him for sure, but we definitely need to see what comes out of the practice reports today, and if we get any news from anyone, over the weekend as well. So obviously, if he doesn't play, things will get really shaken up. But I don't expect that to be the case. He could be limited, but even if he's limited, he's going to be pretty heavily involved in key plays that are passing plays. That's the most likely time that they're going to use him, and that's when he is going to get the most of his points. So I think that's a pretty good spot. So one thing I have, especially on Ekeler injury days, I have a kind of a soft spot for him. Back 2018, I think it was, he was projected by a lot of people to be very limited, and maybe Melvin Gordon would be playing, maybe Ekeler wouldn't be playing. There was just a lot of uncertainty. Anyways, I took a really heavy stance on Ekeler and won me several $100,000 that day. So I think this could be a situation where if people get pretty hesitant to play him, I think it could be a big spot for him still, even if he isn't 100%, just because of his passing volume.
Do you remember if that was a 4 o'clock slate or a 4 o'clock start time or 1 o'clock start time?
Yeah, that was a 4 o'clock game.
Yeah,
which I think even made it even more so, right? Because everyone was hesitant.
That's one of the reasons, because I feel like I remember that game, and I think I remembered you also crushing that day, that one in particular. But I was just trying to remember whether it's 4 o'clock or 1 o'clock, because this is the 1 o'clock start, and it does deliver a little bit of a different situation. And also why I think that if you're building lines right now, you should just have Ekeler in it, because we're going to find out before the game starts whether he's playing or not, and we're going to find out whether he's limited or not. So you can just have him in your player pool, or maybe even build 2 crunches, have one with Ekeler, one without Ekeler. And if he's out, then you'll have to see who's ultimately ends up starting at running back. We kind of saw them mix it up a little bit last year. I'm assuming that Justin Jackson would get the first look at it, but once again, that's something that would require a little bit more information. But yeah, I wouldn't be too concerned about the 1 o'clock start with the injury as of now, because there's going to be more news coming. And if we know, it's not like we're going to be in a panic to totally change everything, because there's not like a late swap situation or anything. But also to Steve's situation about being a 4 o'clock game, some of those situations do end up becoming really valuable because people have already locked in who they're playing at that point. If there's only 3 4 o'clock games, you get Austin Ekeler, number one, not rostered by a lot of people. Then number two, even if he ends up being out in that kind of situation, you play the backup, and nobody's going to be on the backup in that spot. So that is something that last year when I was doing Live Before Lock with Josh Engelman and Spags, that was something we talked about a lot with some players who were questionable. So always a strategy that I'm in on. Some of these other running backs here, those are actually the ones that popped up in my lineups right now most often. Christian McCaffrey, Derrick Henry, Austin Ekeler, Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Who are the other ones that are making it into a lot of your lineups?
So I think one other one that's kind of interesting, and it's kind of a gross play actually, is potentially Joe Mixon. So Mixon price tag is all the way down at $24. I think that and I'm not really ever a Joe Mixon fan. It just seems like he's never really blowing up too often, although he did have a few games where he did. But it feels like he's going to be on the field most of the time, probably 75% of the snaps or so. They don't really have any competition for him. And his game total is really low against Minnesota, who people don't like to play running backs against. So I don't think he's going to catch a lot of ownership. But with having so many options, or with having like so few options, I guess, it's very likely that he's going to score. It's very likely that he's going to get a lot of carries. And I think that he is a pretty safe play to at least have a good floor and upside if he just kind of breaks a play or gets in the end zone a time or two.
Yeah, remember just a year ago, anybody who played in basketball draft, Joe Mixon was a late first round, early second round pick. And now people have really cooled on him. The Bengals offense should be much improved this year. And This is still a fairly tight game. It's not like we're expecting the Bengals to totally get washed away. Minnesota is only favored by 3 points. The total in this spot is 47.5. So I think there is reason to like Joe Mixon. Actually, he's also somebody who I'm well over the field on in my current builds of $24. That's a favorable price point. The other thing that's key with Mixon, too, they don't have Giovanni Bernard on the team anymore. He was their pass-catching back last year, and Joe Mixon could be more involved in the passing game this year. Half-point PPR over on Yahoo, that could benefit him. So I'm on board with that. I like the Joe Mixon call, and like I said, he's popping up in a meaningful amount of my rosters at the moment. And one other guy I want to ask you about, Twitter loves him because of his giant quads, and then also seems like he could potentially be in a pretty big workhorse load this year. That's Mike Davis. Favorable matchup for him against the Philadelphia Eagles, and another guy who I just don't really know that there's a lot of depth on Atlanta. We saw him shoulder, a pretty big workload last year for Carolina at the start of the season when Christian McCaffrey first got hurt. We didn't see him play the exact Christian McCaffrey role. We saw Mike Davis capable of getting a lot of snaps, getting work in the passing game. If he plays anything comparable to that in Atlanta, I think that he could be a pretty massive guy to buy low on to enter the season. So is Mike Davis somebody they're getting to?
Yeah. Mike Davis was the second guy I was going to talk about, actually. So I think that he is really good. I think that there's going to be some hesitancy from people. I think everyone loves to talk about Wayne Gallman recently. I'm not sure I get all the love for Wayne Gallman, and maybe he will eventually take over some of that role, but I mean, Wayne Gallman's kind of been around for a while, and I haven't really ever seen him produce that much. And, Mike Davis was just fine, like you said, in Carolina. So I don't see him being a major issue, but I think that'll keep people away from Davis a little bit. And the other thing I guess we should be careful of a little bit, I do agree that he was very useful in the passing game with Carolina. I think he was targeted on something like, I feel like it was like 28% of the passes or something like that when he was on the field. But the Carolina just passes a lot more to the running backs than what the Atlanta does. So that's one thing that we could see a pretty big decrease in for Mike Davis's role in the passing game, unless Atlanta just changes their philosophy all of a sudden. But that tends to be a little bit consistent year over year, mainly just because of the quarterback. So unless Matt Ryan kind of has a change of heart, I don't know that he'll be involved in the passing game quite as often. So that's just something I'm watching out for. But his price is so cheap that it doesn't matter a whole lot.
No, fair enough and totally reasonable. And then before we move on to the wide receivers, any other running backs here that you'd like to bring up?
I think the one that I think is a little bit interesting is that a lot of people seem like they're on is Najee Harris. So actually don't have him coming up a lot for me. And if people keep talking about him and hyping him up as much as they are, I think I'm going to stay away from him quite a bit. So Najee Harris is like the same situation I was talking about earlier, where if a person is highly uncertain how they're going to play, if they're very heavily owned in these first couple of weeks, then I'm going to stay away from them. If they're low owned, I'm going to stay kind of on them. And Najee Harris seems like he's going to be fairly popular. So to me, that feels like a stay away. They're 6-point underdogs against Buffalo. If the Steelers get behind in a game like that, are they going to stick with Harris all game long? Are they going to just kind of abandon the running game completely? Are they going to use him in the passing game, or are they going to use all the wide receivers that they have? They have so many. Why do they need to necessarily use Najee Harris in that situation? So for $20 price tag, I think I don't know that he's worth competing with so many other people that might have him on their team.
Yeah, we currently have him projected to be in 27.6% of lineups. That makes him the second most popular player on Yahoo. Only Dalvin Cook projected to end up in more lineups as of now. So see if that changes as the weekend rolls along. But to me, like I think Dalvin Cook is a good pay up option, but I'd prefer to get to some of the guys like Christian McCaffrey or Derrick Henry that aren't expected to be as popular. And then Najee Harris is the second most popular running back on the slate. I like to go elsewhere. Somebody like, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, we talked about him. He's projected to be in half the amount of lineups that Najee Harris is in. And currently we have Edwards-Helaire projected a little better. So that to me looks like a favorable spot to make pivots to. So I'm on board with everything you said there. And that's a good shout because he's super popular right now. So if that continues to be the case, I think he's somebody who's good to be underway to, especially considering the game script of that game. Now moving over to the wide receiver position, my number one most rostered wide receiver right now. I kind of talked about him a little bit at the top, and I think you were in agreement with me, but I'll throw this out anyway. The guy I have most often popping on my lineups at the wide receiver position, Laviska Shenault. I love the matchup against the Houston Texans. He's cheap, $15 on Yahoo. We should have a favorable situation this year with Trevor Lawrence as his quarterback. Love the matchup against Houston, obviously. Everything here kind of lines up. I think he should have a good season. And also, if you go over to the player props tool we have for football this year, we have Laviska Shenault projected for 82.5 receptions. Depending what sportsbook you look at, most of them have it right around 60.5. I love that as an overplay. I'm high on Shenault entering the year, and I'm going to start the season by getting a lot of exposure to him.
Nice. Yeah. He's such an exciting player that you really break something against this Houston team for $15. I think that's a really good price point. There is a lot of, options on Jacksonville this year. So I guess if you, not like standout options, but I think you could still consider Marvin Jones a pretty good option in Chark. So there is a lot of guys to feed as at least, kind of semi-good options. And we don't know 100% about Tyler Lawrence, but I think it's a really good spot, especially against that Houston defense that I'm all for picking on. So yeah, give me some Shenault for sure.
Yeah, and one other guy who's popping up a lot for cheap for me, which we talked about earlier, is Devontae Parker. Works with Tua Tagovailoa. So to me, Devontae Parker, another cheap receiver. But in terms of pay up options, I think wide receiver is not quite ideal to spend up for on Yahoo. I think it makes most sense to spend up for the running back position. But with that said, I'm still ending up with Calvin Ridley in a good portion of my lineups. Only $30 for Ridley. We do have him projected by a fairly decent margin to be the top scoring wide receiver on the slate over on Yahoo. We have him outpacing Stephon Diggs by about half a fantasy point. So if you are going to be spending up for somebody, I think Ridley and Diggs are both viable options, but it's a Ridley number one for me. Who is your most popular spend up at wide receiver?
Yeah, so the really nice thing about the wide receiver is there isn't seemingly a consensus that everyone is spending up on or even paying down for either, right? None of the wide receivers were showing to be super popular. So I think that's a really good strategy to kind of mix and match along those same lines. I don't have anyone that, on the pay up options that are super huge. The biggest one that I am on looks like Devontae Adams for the pay up options, but it's not like a super heavy stance. I could see Aaron Rodgers kind of trying to repeat last year where he was just always trying to throw, right at the goal line to kind of inflate his stats. And I could see that kind of being the case again this year after the way the offseason kind of went down. And Devontae Adams was that target last year, and I could definitely see that continuing this year.
Yeah, the matchup against New Orleans, that is the game earlier. I said there was only 2 games with a total over 50 points. Well, 49.5 in the Saints-Packers game, so it's not like that one is all that far behind. Wide receivers also, we've got guys like DK Metcalf, who, by the way, I don't know if you saw this earlier today, but the Colts, like their entire secondary got ruled out ahead of week 1. So this does seem to be a pretty favorable matchup for the Seattle wide receivers. That's something that's going to make it more favorable for me to get to guys like DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. These guys were a headache to figure out last year. If you remember at the start of the year, it was a situation where I kind of had this running joke, which was DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett are tough to predict. And it was just kind of play whoever was in less lineups, just because whoever the field seemed to be lower on went off. And they were very negatively correlated last year. And I kind of feel the same thing is going to happen this year, where it's just going to be some days it's a Tyler Lockett game, some days it's a DK Metcalf game. Ultimately, I'm just going to want to be on whichever of the two is less popular, because if the field's on one side, there's a lot of variance. I think it's a good way to kind of zig when they zag. But between Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf, are these two high upside receivers you're liking in week one?
Yes, yeah, for sure. The one thing that stands out between them is the price difference, though. Metcalf at 26 versus Lockett at 19. Just it seems like a pretty big price difference for the guys that, and you were correct in saying so. It's 50-50 shot almost that one has the huge game and then the other one doesn't. So that is probably going to make Lockett a little bit more popular, I would guess, between the two. So you could you could argue you should just go to Metcalf for that, but that price difference seems pretty material to me, and I think that I'm going to try to go a little bit more towards Lockett. I do like Metcalf just as a full season type of play, but yeah, I think I want to go to Lockett slightly more.
Yeah, and I mean, you talk about boom bust plays. Tyler Lockett had like all his fantasy points in 4 games last year. He had games like, okay, Tyler Lockett is nothing. Oh, he scores all the fantasy points. Nothing. Scores all the fantasy points. And for reference, at the start of last year, so week 3, he had 9 catches for 100 yards and 3 touchdowns against the Cowboys. He follows that up with 2 catches for 39 yards. And I'm almost positive he was massive chalk that week. DK Metcalf went off. Then everybody starts to get off of Tyler Lockett because he has a few bad games in a row. And it's like, okay, Metcalf is the guy. Then a game against the Cardinals. Metcalf has 15 catches for 200 yards and 3 touchdowns. Everybody goes, oh, look, Tyler Lockett's the guy. Let's roster him again. And then he goes 4 catches, 33 yards the next week. So a lot of variance there. And once again, that's something I want to play with whatever the field's doing. If the field is going to be heavy on Lockett, I probably want to be on Metcalf and then vice versa. And Philly Joe in the YouTube chat saying, why not play both Metcalf and Lockett? You could do that in a lineup with Russell Wilson, but if we're just kind of basing it on what we saw last year, it just hasn't been all that frequent that both of them go off at the same time. It kind of seemed like Russell Wilson would hone in on one of those receivers. One of them would have a big game, and the other one would just kind of not really do all that much. So it's something that I think there's a negative enough correlation that I don't really want to get to both of them in the same lineup a lot. Obviously, if Wilson's the quarterback, there's reason to think it could happen, but in general, I think they're better off played alone. But any other wide receivers here that you want to talk about that are making into a good portion of your lineups?
So there was a chat saying McLaurin also. I think McLaurin is a pretty good option because of that same thing. Fitzpatrick being a new quarterback for Washington, I think that there is a good chance that he's going to really lock into McLaurin. Why wouldn't he? He's so good that I think you could see a lot of upside there, even more so. I mean, McLaurin was pretty locked into even last year, but I think that you could even see that even more so this year. So I think that he is a pretty fair option. And the other guy I think is in that same game, and you could even run them back with each other, is Keenan Allen. Keenan Allen at $18 just seems really cheap. That's, equal to like Deebo Samuel, Chase Claypool, Brandon Cooks, Chark. Those are all fine players, but Keenan Allen, especially if Ekeler ends up missing or being limited, I think he gets peppered with so many targets that he's a very good option for you. And I think that he's a pretty safe floor and a possibility that if he scores a couple of touchdowns here or there, people are scared because the Washington defense is pretty tough. But again, their total is 22. Someone's going to score some touchdowns, and it's a good chance that it's Keenan Allen.
All right, and now one guy I want to bring up, and then we could, and then we'll move on to the tight ends. And also, I think there's a little less talk about when it comes to tight ends and defenses anyway. But one of my favorite pivot plays on the slate is Chase Claypool, and it's going to be a little hard to really, I think, hone in on which wide receiver is going to be the guy in any given week in that Steelers passing offense when they have so much firepower at wide receiver. But we talked about Najee Harris and how he's somebody we both want to be underweight to because he's projected to be massively popular on Yahoo this week. It's going to be what should be a fairly high-scoring game between the Bills and the Steelers. So I think we want to get some sort of exposure to the Steelers offense. If we're going to be pivoting off of Harris, and like you said, one of the reasons we think we want to be underweight to him is because it's a game where we are projecting them to be underdogs, so they're going to have to throw the ball more. I think it makes sense to say, like, hey, I want to get my leverage here by getting exposure to the Steelers passing game to get away from the Harris chalk. And ultimately, it is kind of hard to pick the receivers, but I'm landing on Chase Claypool because of the $18 price tag on him, and he is somebody who we saw with massive upside last year. So does that all make sense for Chase Claypool as a GPP option?
Yeah, I think I like that idea really well, actually. So I don't have him coming up a lot right now, but I think those are good reasons to make sure that you're bumping him up, or Deontay Johnson or Juju even a bit. I think Claypool I like the best of that group, but I think all of them you could make that same argument for. And that's one thing to keep in mind too, is as you're building your lineups, you want to make sure that you're thinking about the right story of how you're going to be able to win the contest, not necessarily who projects out the best in terms of raw projections, but how instead are you going to, what story can you tell that's going to get you a GPP winning lineup? And I think you've told a really good one right there.
Yeah, I just wish there was a Steelers receiver that could really be like, this was the guy this week. Because now I feel like it's this thing where also we could be right. And it's like, all right, they threw the ball a lot more. And it wasn't ultimately Najee Harris who scored the points. Then I just picked the wrong Steelers receiver, which is why I kind of want to mix and match these guys. But it is definitely a little bit hard to narrow down there. But Harris does appear to be a little bit too popular. But let's move over to the tight end position now. And there's a pretty big gap at tight end. We've got Travis Kelce, tier of his own. George Kittle, tier of his own. Then it's kind of everybody else. So in the lineups that you have made, how often are you paying up at the tight end spot?
Most of them. So just because those tight ends you mentioned, they're just so much better in general than the rest of the guys, and you have the money to do it. So I think it's worthwhile to make that. Kelce is the guy that I have on the most of my rosters on the crunches that I just ran here, and I think that I have a hard time changing that too much, I would say. So if you're playing just a couple lineups, like maybe 3 lineups, if you played him in 2 of those lineups, I couldn't fault you at all, and maybe Kittle in the other one, for instance. Just because all the other ones, Gesicki could have a touchdown because he has an expanded role now, or you could get something random from Gerald Everett or something like that. But in general, I think if you're kind of wanting to really have a lineup that's going to have the upside to be able to win, these guys are going to have the best chance to really blow open the sky on your team. And that we don't have Darren Waller on the slate either, so there's one less option than what we would normally have to compete with them.
Yeah, I think Kyle Pitts is interesting just from a standpoint of we don't know what we're getting out of him this year. He is an elite tight end prospect. He is also favorably priced at $19, but also I'd rather just pay the $6 for George Kittle because it's like, hey, Kyle Pitts could be a transcendent tight end. George Kittle already is that transcendent tight end, and they're somewhere around the same salary. The other thing also, George Kittle, very favorable matchup against the Detroit Lions. So I'm in the same boat as you, where I have Travis Kelce, and George Kittle makes up a very large chunk of my tight end player pool. And then other guys that ended up making it for me at tight end, it's like, hey, Dallas Goedert, because he correlates with Jalen Hurts in my Eagles stacks. But for the most part, there's not like one other tight end I look at for cheaper. I'm like, oh, this guy is the value play. The pricing's favorable on Yahoo. I kind of think it makes sense to spend up at tight end. But is there any cheap tight ends that did end up coming out in maybe a little bit of a chunkier lineups?
Yeah, I think Goddard for the same reasons that you just mentioned. He looks like he's one of my higher ones at the end. I think Gesicki could have an expanded role than what a lot of people are kind of expecting, and I don't think a lot of people are going to necessarily notice that. So he makes sense as a stack if you're going that to a route. Either him or Waddle, I think, are both guys that you could stack up in, as well as Parker. Don't want to forget him. But any of those 3 guys, I think, make a lot of sense there. But outside of that, it's just kind of a hit or miss type of guys. I did want to bring up about Pitts a little bit. I think he is going to be one of those guys that has a very unpredictable role, but everybody is going to be on. We've heard so many people talk about Pitts all off season. He was the guy that so many people loved in season long. He's the guy everyone loved in best ball. And I think he's going to be that same situation this week as well. And I think we don't know exactly how they're going to use him. We're hypothesizing that he's going to be in for a lot of wide receiver snaps. He's going to be in for a lot of tight end snaps. He's going to be in and always going for, so many different targets. But Atlanta has not really been a huge looker for the tight ends in general, and they still have Ridley. That granted, they don't have Julio anymore, but I think that he has a lot of risk with him, and I get it. He's really good. He's supposed to be this, once every 50 years. He's this generational talent type guy, but Vernon Davis was too, and it took Vernon Davis several years to really develop into that huge game. So I'm not willing to go over the field if he's super popular.
All right, I think that makes sense. And also, I agree with you on Mike Gesicki. In terms of cheap tight ends, there's none that popped up in 20% of my lineups or anything like that. However, Gesicki was the cheap one that popped up most meaningfully for me. Number one in some stacks with Tua, and then number two also just as being a cheap tight end. He's only $12, and there are not that many cheap tight ends that really project favorably for us. So, the 8 fantasy point projection for Gesicki at $12, that's enough for him to pop up in some lineups. Cash games, though, I'd say you pay up for Kelsey or Kittle. Kelsey ideally. But if you don't have the $33 to spend, then going to $25 Kittle is also fine. So those are definitely going to make up the bulk of my tight end exposure over on Yahoo. And let's close up with defenses. Every time I do these shows on Friday or Saturday, I include defenses, get mad at myself for it. But people like to hear who our favorite defenses are. I absolutely hate rostering defenses, and I find it to be very difficult to predict in DFS. But there is at least some very favorable pricing over on Yahoo for the defenses. The two that stand out the most are the Broncos and 49ers. The 49ers at $12, the Broncos at $13. San Francisco going up against Detroit. I just don't understand the $12 price tag. You're paying cash games. I would say certainly go to San Francisco's defense. That Lions offense should be miserable this year. Jared Goff struggled with elite weapons around him at times in Los Angeles. Now he's going to have a bad offensive line. The 49ers defense is elite. So the price is just wrong there.
Yeah, I agree. I think you just lock them into your cash game lineups and call it good and don't have to think about it anymore. Even in your tournament contest, I think that they're the smartest play. They're going to be pretty popular for exactly that same reason, but I don't know that there's a whole lot of reasons that you should go elsewhere other than just trying to be different than the field. And probably I would also agree, the Broncos, they seem to be the other team that are coming up quite a bit for me as well. So I would say going with them would be my secondary option.
Yeah, and that's something also the Broncos, they should have a good defense this year. I think Daniel Jones still has some talent and ability as a quarterback. He makes so many mistakes. He takes a lot of sacks. The Giants have a bad offensive line. He throws a lot of interceptions, fumbles the ball. So there's a lot of upside for the Broncos going up against the Giants because of the amount of times that Daniel Jones turns the ball over and how frequently it should end up leading to defensive touchdowns for teams playing against the Giants this year. So those are the two teams that stand out the most to me. Now, Steve, we only have a couple of minutes left here. So here's how I think we should close. I'm going to put you on the spot here. If you had to make a single entry lineup right now, what would be the stack you would go to in a tournament on Yahoo?
The stack I would go to, I would say probably one of the Miami ones. So Tua with either Gesicki, Devontae Parker, or Waddle, and maybe even potentially two of those. I don't think a lot of people are going to go that route, and I think it's possible that we could see a shootout in this game. It's got a really low total, but we don't know about Mac Jones. We don't know about Tua completely. And 90% of the time it goes with the low total as we would expect. But I think there's that possibility that game could shoot out a little bit and it could go under-owned by a lot.
Give me Matt Ryan to Calvin Ridley. So we just talked about Kyle Pitts a little bit, and it does look like in our projections that Kyle Pitts is going to be really popular. And I'm going to apply some of the same logic before with why I like Chase Claypool when it came to Najee Harris. If Kyle Pitts is going to be this popular and Ridley is going to be, still somewhat popular, but not quite to what I think we expect Pitts to be, I think it just makes sense to, if Pitts isn't getting the targets, where are they going? Probably to Calvin Ridley. So I like that kind of pivot, getting Ridley in there with Matt Ryan as opposed to Kyle Pitts. And I would close up the show, but we just got a super chat, so I want to answer this really quick. Blue Apples asked, if you want to be really different, Dan Arnold seems like the best long shot at tight end he's talking about. I'd rather go with Gesicki. We only have Gesicki projected to be in 0.2% of lineups right now. Dan Arnold, I don't really know what the reasonable upside is for him, but Gesicki, I think, is actually a good tight end who should have good receiving stats this year. So Gesicki would still be my sneaky tight end choice, and was something that Steve and I both liked. But other than that, that is going to do it for us today, guys. And I hope you guys like the show. Hopefully, Steve and I get to do this together again going forward on Fridays, because I like chopping up some Yahoo with them. Other than that, guys, like this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. There's a lot more football content coming up today. And then also got baseball, deeper dive, MLB Live before lock. Good luck this weekend.